I'm going to talk very fast. When I start to talk about trees, sometimes I can't stop. I really talk about the importance of the relationship between people and trees, something that in some ways we've forgotten. And even when we haven't forgotten it, sometimes it's so sad now because so many things are happening to our trees that we don't want, as we know with the pitch pines and the pine barrens, as we also see now with beech leaf disease. So many problems, but the connection between people and trees, I think, is one of the most important connections we have with other kinds of living organisms. So I want to just talk about it for a few minutes, and I'm going to start by telling you about my connection, if that's okay. I was a journalist, and I was a good one, and I wrote about nature, and I wrote about trees, and I wrote about gardens, and I had so much fun. But I always felt somewhat distant from the things I was writing about because I would do it for 6 months, and then I would do something else. So I became an instant expert many times. So then, one day I had to write about pruning. And people said, you got to talk to this guy at New York Botanical Garden, he's really good. So I called him up and said, will you be interviewed by me? And he said, sure, if you'll climb a tree with me. And I said, He didn't know that I used to be a rock climber. So he said to his partner, he said, guess what? I caught me a journalist. So we got 70 foot up a big oak tree in the New York Botanical Garden, and I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And somewhere in the second or third hour, I said, can I do this for a living? And Wayne said, sure you can, and was my mentor for years after. I'm so grateful for that. It changed my life, and it really, because it was it's been my wish to become closer to these living things. And this let me do it, and it's let me do it for the last 35 years, and so I'm very grateful for that. But it doesn't take like spending 35 years in trees to become related to them. It just means going out, seeing them in different seasons of the year. Sometimes if you've planted one, figuring out what it needs, or watching it tell you what it needs. There's so many ways in which we can be related to trees, but the more we are, I think, the more we understand who we are as human beings. So I want to talk just for a few minutes about why trees are such strange and different beings than we are. For one thing, they're a heck of a lot older. The oldest root system, the fossil of the oldest root system ever discovered, was discovered in the town quarry in a little town on the north edge of the Catskills. It's called the town of Cairo. And they found this root system quite inadvertently. They were looking for something else, and they started digging, and they found what looked like a root system, and sure enough it is, but it's much older than any other root system ever found. I'm not going to ask you to guess the age. 385 million years old. So trees had roots. There were older trees than that, but trees had roots for at least the last 385 million years. So we are scarcely even babies compared to these organisms. And the other thing that really, really interests me about them is that they're not really very much like us at all in many ways. We always, it's natural for humans to try and compare things to what we are as humans, but they're very, very different. For one thing, if, say, a branch falls on another branch or a lightning strikes or something like that, all of a sudden a bunch of branches will be broken or fall off. And what does the tree do? The tree says, and takes some more branches and puts them back, right? So if it loses its top, it'll put back the branches. It will find ways to continue to live and thrive without moving. Unlike an animal, it can't run away. But just imagine how different that is from us. Imagine, say I got a cut when I was out in the field one day. If I went to sleep at night, I'd wake up and it'd be sprouting a new arm and hand. But this does not happen to us. So these creatures are very, very different from us. And in many ways, they're not so much, we talk about them as intelligent, which I think is good and right, but that's, again, comparing them to us. In many ways, I think they're more, maybe not intelligent is the right word, maybe they're more poetic than us. Intelligence means that we kind of think about something, reflect on it, and make a decision. I don't think trees do that. I think trees, when something occurs to them, something happens to them or around them, they change immediately. They immediately try 4 or 5 different things to try and change into something different. So it might be interesting to think of them as poetic. But in any case, they're much smarter than we are, and they have no brains at all, which probably gives us a sense of what the value of brains is. The other thing about it is they have so few parts to them. I had the great privilege and terror of having to speak after the great French tropical botanist Francis Allais at a conference in Spain. And Francis's speech consisted of very short. He said basically, human beings have 68 organs. None of them work very well. We die quite young. Trees, 3 organs: root, stem, leaf. And botanists will tell you that flowers and fruit are modified leaves. So root, stem, leaf. And he says with those 3 organs, they live far, far longer than we do. And sometimes, when they seem to have died, they return again. So that's the other thing about trees. They're so creative that out of this very simple 3-part module, they make trillions and trillions of absolutely unique trees by their ability to respond to the world around them. Tried to keep myself from getting lost here. There we go. So we're going to see this film about redwoods very shortly, and I was able to watch it online thanks to Jackie. It's great. And it's great not only because it shows these great, huge, marvelous, gigantic, long-lived trees, but also because it shows how crazy and playful they are. So one thing about redwoods, unlike many of the conifers, are not very good at sprouting, particularly not at sprouting again from the base, but redwoods always do. They make fairy rings. So around a great big redwood, I grew up in California, so my parents, when they wanted to get rid of me for a while, would take me to Big Basin Redwood Park, and my brother and I would run around there, and they would have the fun with their friends. So we knew a lot about the redwoods there, and we saw that the big ones often had an entire ring of little ones around them. And over time, when the big one went away, some of the fairy ring would die, but you could always tell there'd been a fairy ring there, because you could still see that kind of semicircular signature of the root flare, the way the roots were organized on the trees that had been part of a fairy ring. So I was back there about 5 years ago and looked at one of the oldest trees in Big Basin, which is said to be more than 2,000 years old. But if you look closely at its root system, you can see that it had that little circular pattern. So that tree was part of a fairy ring, that is a sprout, possibly from a tree that was 2,000 years old when it was a sprout. And how far back can we go? And how far forward will that go in the way these trees are living? So it's this kind of ability of trees to refuse to give up, to make themselves over and over again, that is just astounding to me and really inspiring to me. And not only that, but when you go into the redwood forest, and I think they'll talk a little bit about it here, the interesting thing is that the redwoods are not alone. You would think that they're so prolific, and occasionally when they've been cut and come back again, they are alone, which they'll talk about in the film. But in an old-growth redwood forest, you see that there's a lot happening besides the redwoods. So there's lithocarpus, which is a tan oak, which is one of the main trees in that part of the world, usually 60 feet tall. But in a redwood forest, they become ivy. They crawl over the ground. And then they find a gap in the canopy, and bam, up they go, right? And they become a tree again. And likewise, the live oaks, which are the evergreen oaks of California, will grow typically right along the edge of a man-made pathway or along the edge of a stream because there's a ribbon of light there. And they will bend their trunks over, so the trunks bend over the river of light, and then they will release sprouts upwards. So basically they've created a scaffold for things to grow on. And then there's huckleberry. And huckleberry, California, or not native California huckleberries are just like, you could map the light on the forest floor by finding where the huckleberries are. Because they find it and they go to it and then they'll climb up things. It's really quite extraordinary. So it's not only the one thing, it's all of the stuff that's happening in these forests. And trees do this everywhere. You know, you think the American chestnut's done that, right? The American chestnut was destroyed, again, by an imported fungus, right? But it wasn't destroyed. You can still, I'm not sure how many of you have seen them, but you will still find a good number of young chestnuts growing hither and yon. They get big enough, they get the disease, and they die, but not before they've saved enough energy to sprout again. So they just have become shrubs. And maybe they're just going to wait for a change of days, and then they'll come up again. 8,000 years ago, the pollen records show that hemlock totally disappeared from this part of the world. There was suddenly no hemlock pollen, but they came back. Maybe the chestnuts were working hard to get them to come back, but they may come back on their own as well. And you see it, I suspect it's happening with white ash now. Up where I am, white ash, all the big ones are gone, but tons and tons of little ones are coming up. And I think they're doing the same game, which is I'll get big enough, and then when I get big enough, the borer will be interested in me. Till then I can grow, and then I can start all over again. So trees are just able to do these things in just amazing, amazing ways. And I think when Tucker comes to talk about his fallen tree arboretum, he'll talk a lot about the strange creativity of trees. But a forest isn't just an assembly of trees, it's a living being in itself. It has as much mass going on, a lot going on above ground, a lot going on below ground. It's said that in an average forest soil, a teaspoon of that soil contains more microorganisms than there are people currently alive on the earth. But if you go next to the root, in the root zone, and take another teaspoonful of soil, there are 1,000 times that number of organisms. So it's a vast network of organisms that form a forest and that form the land that we're living in. And so when we become related to those plants, even just by walking with them, or by, as our great teacher in trees had the motto of every single book he wrote, Alex Shigo, was touch trees. By just going out and becoming, however we become related to them, we become a part of that forest. Right? Because the forest is the whole, some people call it a holobiont, the whole set of living things that make up that system. So anyway, I'm really looking forward to this show, and I hope you all are too. And this is a great, I was so excited when I heard that there was a documentary film festival that would focus entirely on trees and forests. Thank you all very much.